if you look at Malaysia, look at the chart on the right, that's how our GDP has been growing and our per capita income has been growing, you know. Our GDP, gross domestic product, has been, in 1970 was 10.3 billion of that ringgit at that time. In 2019, it went up to 1.5 trillion, otherwise 1,500 billion. Okay, so if you divide 1,500 by 10.3, you get 146, right? But you cannot say our wealth went up by 146 times because inflation was, 450% in that 50 years, and population increased by 10 million, from 10 million to 32 million. So if you divide the 146 divided by the price increase and by the increase in population, you get 10.11. Now 10.11 talks about is the per capita GDP has gone up 10 times between 1970 and 2019. So if per capita we're 10 times more wealthy, why is there still poverty? This, I think, is a very important question, because if we just talk to the market-friendly guys, they say, let's grow the economy somewhere. The way out of poverty is to grow the economy. But not necessarily to grow the economy, so much, to the extent that, Malaysia is a success story then. If the per capita, has gone up tenfold, and we still have poverty for about 20% of the population, then this growth does not solve the problem, right? So that's the first issue, right? The second one, please. Next slide, please. So if you look at the question of why is there still poverty, of course, from the Marxist point, that's Marx, by the way, he will analyze it in terms of, C is capital spent on machinery, on raw materials. V is variable capital. C is constant capital. V is variable capital spent on labor. And S is the surplus extracted from labor. And that all equals the exchange value of the commodity, which is actually the amount of labor in the commodity. But not all that value is given to the laborer. The capitalist grabs S, the surplus. And that's what Marx would call as the exploitation. And he's, look at capital, he'll compare S to V and rate of exploitation and all that. Very good, very interesting. And I think it gives you an insight as to how value is created in the form of commodities and how value created by workers is taken by the group of capitalists. And if you want to read Marx, I suggest you look at, get David Harvey to help you. It's a guy called David Harvey who's come out with a number of tutorials, about 10 tutorials, So if you want to read Marx, get David Harvey. Otherwise, it's really, really off-putting. The idea of Marx is you can't extract surplus from C because it's sold to you by other capitalists. C is sold to you by other capitalists, selling to you at the exchange value of the commodity. That is true. That is true value in terms of labor embodied. Whereas V is what you buy, labor power that you buy, which you underprice. You don't pay the laborer the full value of his work. And that's where you get the S, the surplus. That's Marx, okay? But this by itself, this is very illuminating, but this by itself doesn't explain the poverty fully in Malaysia. Okay, if you look at Malaysia, we have factories producing, these are people working in a factory and they're producing this component, okay? Now this component sold at the factory gate in California would be USD $2. But when that same factory is outsourced to Malaysia, with the same machines, the same kinds of machines, the same technology, exactly the same product being produced in buy and La Paz, that same component will be sold at the factory gate at 1/8 the price, at US 25 cents. There's an 8-fold difference. All right. Now, this is why they outsource, you see. The big businesses, the MNCs, the multinational corporations, they come out to Malaysia, to Vietnam, to China, because they can get these components at 1/8 or 1/10 the price. They will have to pay in US here. And so what they do is they'll come out and they'll put some factories in Penang, they'll put some factories in maybe Thailand, they'll put some factories in Vietnam, at least 2 or 3 factories in the region. So then they have Malaysian businessmen in Penang and Vietnamese businessmen in Vietnam, same technology, they outsource the technology as well, and they get the same components. If the fella in Penang says, hey, look, hey, guy, how come you pay me so low for this component? I know that in the US, this component is selling at this price. Can you give me a bit more? The MNC will say, if you're not too happy, then we'll shift our orders to Vietnam or to Indonesia or to Thailand. So they basically play off the suppliers at the ASEAN level to keep the unit price of the component. So basically, okay, the guy on the left is the Malaysian guy in Bayan Lepas. The guy on the right is the Vietnamese guy in maybe in Saigon, and they're working on the same thing. The guy in the center is the MNC, and they're able to play off these two guys. So yes, there is, if you look at Marx, there's the C plus B plus S operating between the Malaysian capitalist and his workers, and also between the Vietnamese capitalist and his workers. But a large part of the S doesn't go to the Malaysian capitalist. It goes to the US businessman. Okay, so our analysis now of exploitation of labor and the underpricing of labor in the third world has got to factor in this thing as well, the MNCs, the global chains. See, the Malaysian capitalist is actually quite hamstrung. He's producing components for a particular product. He cannot, maybe he's producing for Hewlett Packard or something like that. Now, he cannot go and say, okay, I'm not going to sell it to you, I'm going to sell it to Sony, or I'm going to sell it to Mitsubishi. Cannot. That component is specifically for the American product. He's not free to go and sell it to anywhere else. And maybe it's also protected by patents as well, He'll get sued with a lawsuit if he goes and tries and sells it anywhere else, makes it on his own and sells it anywhere else. So he's locked into the global chain. So he has borrowed money from banks to build his factory and to start the thing up and all that. And of course, he's making money. He's not making a loss. No question about that. He's making money, but he makes money by keeping our workers' wages down. He keeps wages down, so he makes his surplus. He makes his profits. But the guy making the really big profits is the fat fellow in the middle, who's able to game the system. And a lot of the surplus squeezed out from our labor actually ends up in the MNC's pockets. And there also, the whole thing also, the MNC also doesn't take the money back to the US right away. They take it to Cayman Islands, take it to Bahamas. They keep it there. They do transfer pricing, so they don't declare profits in the US. They declare their profits in Bahamas. They escape taxes, tax havens. The whole thing works like that, But for us in Malaysia, this factor, the factor that our what we call wage suppression, because our businessmen are in a way bullied, by the MNCs, that they cannot sell their products at the prices the products could be sold in Europe, or the same product was produced in Europe, it will be sold at a much higher rate. If it's produced in America, it will be sold at a much higher rate. But produced in Malaysia, they can push it down by making us compete with other factories in the region. They keep it at a low rate. So this has got to be factored in. I don't see this in Marx, but this is it's also a Marxist kind of approach to it. But we've got to factor in this reality. That means our enemy is not just the capitalists in Bayan Lepas. It is also this whole global chain. The whole way things are done. This is a good book. If you look at this thing, this guy John Smith, who wrote this book of Imperialism in the 21st Century, he really goes. There's a whole book on this, and it just takes up case studies of things and studies in Bangladesh, in China, Foxtron, and all that. And he writes very in simple language, not like Marx. It's easier to read than Marx, and it's interesting. And I strongly recommend this book if you have interest in this. Now, the other thing I want to talk about, how wealth. When talk about why is there poverty, you got to talk about something called commodification. Okay, this is a quarter area in Ipoh, and there are areas like this in many of our major towns. So if you look at housing in the 70s, 60s, 70s, up to the early 80s, people coming in from the rural area, estate workers or even peasant farmers, rural areas come to town, they can't afford to buy a house or rent a house. They go to an empty patch of land and they build a house on their own, with the help of friends. They don't get the loan. They don't take a bank loan at all. So they can build a house within a week, They get cast off timber and all that. Quite cheaply, they can build a house. It isn't the most comfortable, but, they're okay, They have zinc roofs. Those who can afford a bit put a ceiling and then it's not longer so warm, and they build these houses. And so they get a housing for themselves, their family. And then let's say if your uncle or your auntie is now a widow and she's got nowhere to stay, you also come along and you can just extend your house a bit, put one more room on the side, and they're okay, So So they could expand, they could have a family living together. And the important thing is never had to go and get a bank loan. I think now this is no longer possible. There's no property which is free like this. Even unused government land, it's all become private property. You heard this term, fencing up the commons, has taken place. Now, no one can go and build a house on their own. The people's capacity to build a house and look to one of the basic needs, housing, has been taken away. What has happened is in most areas, most states, state governments have given large tracts of state land to their GLCs. They got the GLCs, they've given state land. And these GLCs then make deals with property developers and they sell this land to them, or they go into joint venture and they produce houses. So now you've got to buy a house, you've got to buy it from a property developer and end up in a loan with the bank for the rest of your working life. So basically this is it. Now I think the cheapest house on the market is what, 100,000, 150,000, and your monthly payments is 800. I think is about the lowest monthly payment, And so remember earlier on I showed you the mean wages, the average wage of ordinary workers is about 1,008 to 2,000. You're going to spend about almost $1,000 paying for your housing loan, and not for 1 or 2 years. This goes on for 20, 25 years. So basically the little amount of wealth earned by our working people is squeezed off by the state GLCs and the private sector developers in housing. So there's a process of commodification where things that last time people could do on their own, they were self-sufficient in providing their own house. Now they no longer, they have to go to the market. The market expands to that, and then you have to get indebted to it. And it's a big mess, right? So this is the other element we got to understand. You see, so if you look at this house that we had last time in Scott areas, actually also enabled the family to look after elderly members. If someone doesn't have a place, you can ask them to come and stay with you. Now you buy one of these small houses, or you buy a flat with 700 square feet. It's hardly enough for your own family and your children. You end up, you cannot, if any older person in the family comes in, there's no room. There's no room. The person got to sleep with the children, or the person got to sleep in the hall. So you can't take in an old person. So now, that means then for the older persons now, you got to look for a home, old folks home. And you got to pay for the old folks home. Then let's say, for example, the man is working, the wife also wants to go to work, and the small children at home. In this kind of squatter houses, there's usually an old person around. Childcare isn't a problem. Your mom or your aunt or your uncle who's staying with you can keep an eye on the children. Before they go to school, they come back. The guy is still around, he can keep an eye on them, make sure they get the food, keep an eye on them. Now no more possible. You're in a small little urban unit, you got to get childcare. So the cost of living goes up because things that previously the family could provide for itself, home itself, looking after the elderly, looking after children, childcare. After you deliver, now the maternity homes, and after you deliver, you can check into maternity home for 6 weeks. The packages for $5,000 to $10,000, but they look after you, do the massage and all that. Everything becomes commodified, becomes a part of the market. So it's the process of capitalism. There's commodification. So basically, the cost of living goes up, self-sufficiency of the family unit is compromised, indebtedness goes up, and the income isn't enough. So you got to understand that everything becomes a burden, things that last time we could provide for ourselves. Now, though the income is more, our income is more. I think in the 70s, rubber tappers earned about something like $300 a month. Now they earn about $1,200. So it's 4 times more, in money terms. But the burdens are much more. So if you want to look at poverty in Malaysia, these 3 yellow arrows kind of show the dynamics, the 3 processes that squeeze the wealth out of the working people, right? So at one is the one I talked about. The left-hand one most is commodification, one I talked about last. The taking away of the commons, the extension of the market. So people got to pay more and more for things that last time they could do for themselves. So that takes away what little income they have. The second arrow is the one, the classical exploitation within the workplace between the capitalist and the majikan and the worker. The other arrow on the right is between how our businessmen, poor fellows, are getting bullied by the big capitalists, the Forbes 500 fellows, they are the fellows actually taking in the cream from all over the world, bullying our businessmen. Have you ever heard of a socialist being a bit sorry for our local businessmen? But anyway, our businessmen be bullied by international capitalists. At the same time, they also drive down the prices of commodities. Rubber, cocoa, cotton, you name it. Any agricultural commodity, the value in terms of the effort it takes to produce it is undervalued. And the peasants all over the world are not getting a fair share for their labor. Same guys on the top do the same thing. They push down the prices. So this is the reality that we face in the third world, where our output, our labor is undervalued. There's wage suppression. There's a suppression of the value of our labor, whether it's in the farm, in the mines, in the factories, wherever, So we're facing that as well. So there's three parallel processes, going on. And that's why there's poverty. We've got to understand poverty in that way. Okay, next one, please. So I think, for any of us interested in doing something about a problem, you've got to diagnose it. As a doctor, I'll tell you the most important thing is diagnosis. You get it right, and you're well on the way to solving the problem. If you misdiagnose, you miss something, the patient can update because you're on the wrong track. So diagnosis is important. So that's my diagnosis. The three primary processes we got to handle. The next one, please. So if you look at these three things, in this process of being of the MNCs, the imperialism part of it, bullying our local capitalists and squeezing out surplus. So we got to, the first thing I put here below is stop the competition among ASEAN countries for FDI. Because right now, Malaysia is competing with Vietnam, competing with Thailand for FDIs. To talk about silly competition among the ASEAN countries, where we are all in a race to the bottom. We keep our wages down because we want to attract FDI, and we undercut each other. We are lowering our corporate tax. Malaysia had a corporate tax of 40% of corporate profits in 1980s. From 88 onwards, started lowering it. Now we are 24% of profits as corporate tax. So down from 40% to 24%. Yes. And Singapore is 18% now, corporate tax. So in fact, our government has said we could lower it further. So this is the kind of competition among ASEAN countries where we control wages. We bring down our corporate profits, our tax on corporate sector. So this is compromising us. You got to bring in better trade agreements. That we can have trade agreements that prevent this race to the bottom. Like for example, in ASEAN we have almost 98% of goods and services in ASEAN are not taxed, when they go to other ASEAN countries. We can put in something in the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement saying that if any ASEAN countries lowers its corporate tax by, lowers corporate tax any further from wherever it is now, we will put a 5% tariff on all its goods to other ASEAN countries. Yeah, taxing the rich that you could talk about. Yeah, taxing the rich is something that actually is coming up now. In fact, there are a lot of programs across the world talking about cutting down tax havens, and even like in America, they brought up the idea of a 15% minimum tax on corporate profits globally. So these ideas are coming up. So all these kinds of things have come in its first arrow. How do we make the richest MNCs pay their proper share of tax? How do we prevent tax evasion? All these things, and these come under better trade agreements as well. How do we close the tax loopholes? There's a lot of financial liberalization in the trade agreements. How do you look into that? Some of it is very technical, but these are things we got to tweak. And one of the things they use to also squeeze the surplus from us is patent laws, the IPR laws. IPR stands for intellectual property right laws, where it enables them to squeeze the surplus from our countries. This thing also you got to look into. It's not something you do overnight. It's not something you can do one country by itself, but still it's something that can be done. The group of 77 in the UN, all the developing countries, or ASEAN countries, we can look into these things. And we have to look into this axis of exploitation. And for this one, for the commodification, and for the increased price of goods and all that, we got to talk in terms of the social wage, that the government has a duty to tax the rich more, tax the corporate sector more, and make available social housing. Like in UK, they have what they call the council houses, where the houses are built by the government and rented out at cheap rates to the of the bottom layer of the population. So, like for example, the B20, those earning less than $3,000 a month, family income, we should allow them to rent houses. We used to have it, we had these PPR schemes, where people can rent houses for $120 a month, $200 a month. We should have more of these in all our major towns. We have housing, reasonable housing, not too small. There shouldn't be little, bird pen kind of thing. There should be at least 800 to 900 square feet. And in housing establishments where there is community space for children to play and there's place for tuition. But we should build this in a large scale and get and then open up to people. See what's happening now in Malaysia is, with the urban development, a lot of the people living in low-cost housing in the squatter areas, the wooden houses, the ground tenants, are getting kicked out. Even in Sungai Siput, such a small, out of the, not a big town, but even there I can see over the last 20 years, a lot of the poor areas where there were squatters, where there were ground tenants, are slowly getting evicted, and there's development, so-called development coming up. But the people getting evicted from there cannot buy housing in the areas being developed. It's far beyond them. So we need, even in Sungai Siput, we need PPR housing schemes, where people who are formerly squatters renting a house for $100 a month can now rent a PPR flat or PPR low-cost terrace house for a similar amount of money. So this is part of what we call a social wage. Our concept is you can't pay them a proper wage. Right now, in the short run, if you raise wages too high, Malaysian manufacturing, Malaysian plantation sector will not be able to compete with ASEAN neighbors. And we will lose market and we will lose employment. So we cannot. Yeah, HDB model correct. So we lose that, you see. Whereas if you have housing for rent like this, it's one of the things we do in social wage. Similarly, a lot of families are forced to buy health insurance because they're scared if they get something serious, the government will not serve them in time. But if we had a larger health budget, had more hospital services, built more government hospitals, had more government specialists, then people could rely on the government hospitals, and people don't have to buy insurance. So again, it's a social wage. Could you have universal old age pension? So the older people in the family get $300 a month. Again, this comes into the family income. So, so these are the things you got to look at to deal with this axis of commodification and taking over the commons and making health things more expensive. You can make it less expensive by having a social wage, of course. And this is what a lot of leftists will talk about, the exploitation within the workplace. Of course, that is going on, and we're going to talk about unionization. I mean, can we have compulsory unionization like in Vietnam? Every worker is unionized, and so they can bring in other laws. They can bring in better enforcement of labor laws. Right now, we have very few people working in the labor ministry, to enforce labor laws. So these are all these three axes have got to be dealt with. Okay, I'm coming to the end. A couple of more slides. Next one, please. So to do these things, there are two different views of it. There are some people who look at what's going on now and saying this is the only possible system. So we've got to adjust the Malaysian economy, become business friendly, make sure our graduates are market enabled, they have the soft skill, and we compete for more investments, and we go with the system. That's the Singapore model. You go along with the capitalists and try and get as much out of it as possible. There's the other view that's the left view, which is a minority in Malaysia. I think Malaysia, most of the parties, even the PH parties, support the one on the top. The left view is there is marked wage suppression. The system is stacked against developing countries. We need to reverse the race to the bottom so the working people can enjoy a larger share of the wealth they produce. And this means challenging the unfair structures in the international economy that sucks out the wealth from our countries, that forces us into unequal trade agreements, that creates a financial situation that's so liberalized that the wealthy can take their wealth and hide it in tax havens. We need to look into that as well. And that view, I think, is the minority view in Malaysia. People don't don't see it. Most political parties don't see it, and even most NGOs don't see this thing very well. And actually, if you look at it further back, this system that we have now, the global system, goes back to the Spanish, what they call themselves, conquistadors, these jokers who went to Latin America, and basically it's capitalism spreading from Europe, went across the world, and subjugated almost the whole world. And it still is the dominant force, capitalism that came from Europe. And some of these companies which went to the East India Company, the Dutch East India Company and all that, many of them have morphed into the current Forbes 500 group. Of course, there's some new guys there as well, but they are the same group of people, and they have been plundering the rest of us for a rather long time, So if you look at the world, green is the Europe, the countries they went to earliest, South America, for example, they actually finished off the people there, the local people there. There was genocide. North America, South America, the indigenous people were just wiped out, partly through conquest, otherwise through disease. And when in South America, when they got their independence in the 1850s, 1870s, around that time, when they got independence, it wasn't the indigenous people of those countries who fought against the Europeans and got independence. No, it was the settlers from Spain and Portugal who fought the mother country, and the settlers gained independence. Almost all the countries in Latin America, all the countries in North America, Canada, Mexico, US itself, it wasn't the indigenous people who became the rulers, the leaders of the independent republics there. They were all the settler colonialists. That was the worst affected. Then they went to Africa, slave trade like mad, and Africa was really devastated. And they carved up Africa into funny nation states by straight lines, which they more because of colonial big powers cutting up. And so you have a situation where you have nation states which cut across tribal lines, you have different tribes in them, and you have a lot of problems, and Africa remains the poorest. So as colonialism spread further and further, I think people like we were a bit lucky, we were further away from the epicenter of European capitalism, Japan was the furthest away, and they escaped being colonized, So I think there's a pattern in the whole thing. And what's happening now is not divorced from what happened then. The process didn't stop when you got independence in 1957. After World War II, most countries got independence. The countries were not, the settler colonialists got independence much earlier, 100 years earlier. The others, the third world people got independence after World War II, but it wasn't a full independence. So there was this process, for the last 500 years, there was direct plunder, there was enslaving, there was genocide, settler colonialism, there's colonial rule like in Malaysia and surplus extraction. And after that, there have been unfair terms of trade, suppression of value of labor, maintained by current WTO rules, intellectual property rights. And the problem is, most of our people in the EPU, most of our think tanks in the country have been brainwashed. They buy all the crap the World Bank gives, and they follow the World WTO rules. They themselves will enforce intellectual property rights. That is the problem that we are currently facing. Next one, please. And don't forget, at the same time, we're blaming the international elite and the MNCs. I also want to say, when you talk about the MNCs, I'm not blaming the whole Western population. The working class in the West also are on the receiving end. Their welfare state has been taken away. Their jobs have been chopped up and given to China and outsourcing of jobs. So there's so much anger in the West and so much, right-wing reaction because the system has failed them as well. There's a lot of people in the West, in America and all that, who have actually seen their level of living has gotten worse. Their amenities have gotten worse, their social protection has gotten worse, they're deeper in debt, they're more into unemployment, underemployment, precarious employment. So it's not a question of us fighting the white people as a people, It is all of us fighting the small group of imperialists, capitalists. That's how you got to frame it, It's not us against the white man, Okay, but then leaving that aside, you can't let the Malaysian elite off the hook either, They are fencing up the commons, and the government is doing it. The UMNO government is doing it, fencing up the commons. commodifying everything, collecting rents, hiding the exploitation behind OSC laws, dividing the people using race and religion. And the people have bought it hook, line, and sinker. We look at Malaysia now, the way in which you look at politics depends so much on which race you are in, which religion you are in. The view of people on Pakatan Harapan depends whether you're Malay or non-Malay. Generally, the Malays will be a bit reluctant to go back to Pakatan Harapan, whereas the non-Malays will be dead against going for the other parties. So we are so divided. All of us are so divided. So we need to really empower the Rakyat to challenge all this. That means forming a multiracial movement that understands the problems, that is empathetic about, has empathy for the problems of the other races. So we need to do all that. Next one, please. My favorite. Jeyakumar. He said this, be realistic and do the impossible. And I think what this means for me is that some things may be impossible right now, given the current strength of the popular forces, the current understanding of the people, the current alliances that we can forge. It can be impossible now to do certain things. But being realistic means you see what are the steps that are needed to overcome the current barriers, to overcome the current divisions, to overcome the current weaknesses, so that the mass movement can be built, the multiracial mass movement can be built. That is being realistic. And then, so being real, and then when if you are realistic and you build the mass movement, it no longer is impossible. The impossible becomes possible. So I think when he said do the impossible, it didn't mean just out of the top of your head say you're going to do something, and go for that and come out with some slogans for that. That will not work. You have to be realistic and create the forces in society, create the machinery, create the party, create the people's movements, create the analysis, create the culture that supports it, create the ideological hegemony, the cultural hegemony that will make you, that will take